somewhere beyond mile marker 47, past the edge of every map that matters. There is a rock in the North Atlantic that does not forgive mistakes. They call it Eilean Mòr, the Big Isle. A cruel joke, really, because there is nothing big about it. Nothing except the sky pressing down and the sea pressing up, and the men who once stood in between. I'm Sierra Sterling, and tonight, we go back. Back to the 7th of December, 1900. Back to a lighthouse that should not have gone dark. Back to 3 men who vanished so completely, so absolutely, that over a century later, we are still asking the same question their families asked when the telegrams arrived. Where did they go? Let me set the scene for you, because the setting matters. The Flannan Isles sit 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis, in the outer Hebrides of Scotland. 7 islands, scattered like broken teeth across grey water. The largest of them, Eilean Mòr, is barely large enough to hold a lighthouse and the 3 men required to keep it burning. It took the Stevenson family. Yes, that Stevenson family, the same engineering dynasty whose relatives gave the world Robert Louis Stevenson and his tales of pirates and monsters. Nearly 7,000 pounds and years of brutal labor to build a light on that rock. Materials had to be hauled up sheer cliffs by crane. Men lived in tents through freezing gales just to lay the foundation. When the light finally came alive on December 7th, 1899, it was hailed as a triumph of engineering over nature. Exactly 1 year later, nature would have its answer. The keepers were not strangers to hardship. James Ducat, the principal keeper, was a steady hand, a family man, 20 years into a career spent taming the loneliest coastlines in Scotland. Thomas Marshall, the second assistant, was younger but capable, reliable enough to be trusted with the logbook, the official record of weather, duties, and the small, mundane details that make up a keeper's endless days. And then there was Donald MacArthur, not a permanent member of the crew. He was filling in, covering for a 3rd keeper who'd been sent ashore, sick. MacArthur had a reputation, tough, occasionally hot-tempered, the kind of man you wanted beside you in a storm. Not against you. 3 men, 1 rock, and a job that demanded, above all else, discipline. Because lighthouse protocol was absolute on one point. You never, under any circumstances, leave the light unmanned. At least 1 keeper remained inside always, no matter what happened outside those walls. Whatever happened on Eilean Mòr in the 2nd week of December, 1900, it broke that rule completely. The first sign that something was wrong came from the sea itself. On the morning of December 15th, a steamer called the Archtor passed near the islands and noticed something deeply unsettling. The light was not lit, not flashing, not burning, just dark. In an era before radio, before any means of instant communication, the crew of the Archtor could do nothing but note the anomaly and continue on their route, reporting it only once they reached port. By the time the relief vessel Hesperus arrived at Eilean Mòr, it was already the 15th. Captain Jim Harvey brought the ship in close, expecting the usual welcome. A flag raised on the signal halyard, a small boat rowed out to meet them, the ordinary rhythm of a routine changeover. Nothing came. No flag, no boat, no answer to the horn blasts Harvey ordered sounded across the water, again and again, echoing uselessly against the cliffs. No response to the flares fired into the gray afternoon sky. The silence was the first clue, and it was the worst one. A relief keeper named Joseph Moore volunteered to go ashore alone. Picture it with me. A man climbing a narrow, treacherous path up sheer rock, sea spray still clinging to the stone, heart hammering with every step, calling out names that would receive no answer. Ducat, Marshall, MacArthur, nothing but wind and the cry of seabirds. The entrance gate was closed. The main door, closed. Inside, the beds were unmade. The clock had stopped, and the men who were supposed to be tending the most important light on this stretch of coastline were simply gone. Vanished from a locked island. Vanished from a place with nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and no boat missing from the shore to explain how they might have left. Moore's telegram back to the mainland would become one of the most haunting messages in maritime history. A lighthouse, fully stocked, fully operational. and utterly empty of the men sworn to keep it alive. Tonight, we're going to walk through every inch of that investigation. We're going to look at the logbook and the strange, unsettling entries written in the keeper's final days. We're going to examine the physical evidence at the West Landing, where something clearly happened. Something violent, something final. And we're going to separate the poetry and myth that's grown up around this case from the cold, hard, documented reality of what the Northern Lighthouse Board actually found. Because make no mistake, this case has been mythologized, turned into ghost stories, turned into tales of sea monsters and abandoned meals still steaming on the table, and clocks stopped at the exact moment of some supernatural event. Most of that is fiction. Beautiful, haunting fiction, written by a poet who never set foot on that island. The truth is stranger, in its own quiet way. Because the truth doesn't need monsters. The truth is just 3 men, an angry sea, and a series of small human choices that add up to a tragedy we're still trying to fully understand. Keep the doors locked tonight and stay close to the fire, because before this episode is over, we're going into that lighthouse together. We're going to stand where Joseph Moore stood and feel what he felt when he realized they simply weren't there anymore. The frequency is open. Let's begin. Before we go further into what was found, I want you to understand what was lost, because these were not anonymous figures in a history book. These were men with names, with families, with lives that extended far beyond that lonely rock in the Atlantic. James Ducat, 43 years old, a principal keeper with 2 decades of service already behind him, married, with children waiting for him on the mainland, children who would grow up without a father and without ever knowing exactly how he died. Ducat was, by every account, a careful man, methodical, the kind of keeper who followed procedure because procedure was the only thing standing between a man and the sea's indifference. Thomas Marshall, younger than Ducat, only in his 20s, newly enough in the service that this posting still carried the weight of responsibility and pride. It was Marshall's handwriting that filled the log book in those final days. And it's Marshall's words, more than anyone else's, that historians have picked apart for a century, searching for some hidden meaning, some clue buried in the mundane language of weather reports and duty rotations. And then Donald MacArthur, the substitute, the outsider in a sense, filling a spot that wasn't originally his. MacArthur had a reputation for toughness, for a temper that could flare under pressure. Some later accounts, and I want to be honest with you, these accounts are largely undocumented folklore rather than verified historical record, suggested tension between MacArthur and the other 2 men. Tension that may have existed, or may have simply been added later by writers eager to fill in the gaps of an unsolvable mystery. Now let's talk about that logbook, because this is where the case begins to feel less like a maritime accident report and more like a slow, creeping horror story written by the very men who were living it. Thomas Marshall's final entries describe worsening weather. He notes, according to widely cited historical transcriptions, a severe storm on December 12th, rain and wind lashing the tower. But here's the detail that has fascinated researchers for generations. Official meteorological records from the region show that December 12th was, by most accounts, a relatively calm day. The severe storm that Marshall described in such vivid, almost desperate terms, didn't match the weather data. Sit with that for a moment. Either Marshall's log was inaccurate, a simple human error in a stressful, isolated environment, or something else was happening on that island. Something that made a trained, professional keeper perceive violent, terrifying weather, where the official record shows calm seas. The entries grow stranger still. Marshall writes that Ducat had become quiet, withdrawn, and in a detail that has become almost legendary in true crime circles. He notes that Donald MacArthur, the tough one, the hardened one, was crying. A grown man, a keeper selected specifically for his resilience, crying in the isolation of a lighthouse, days before he and his companions would vanish entirely. What could reduce a man like that to tears? Fear of the sea, certainly, if a storm truly was battering that tower with the ferocity Marshall described. Isolation, certainly. The Flannan Isles are among the most remote inhabited, and I use that word loosely. Postings in the entire British Isles, but some researchers have speculated about something closer to what we would now call psychological breakdown. The particular, grinding stress of total isolation, layered with fear, layered with the unpredictable temperament of a substitute keeper, thrown into an unfamiliar rotation. We cannot know for certain. And I want to be careful here, because this is where fiction so easily creeps in and replaces fact. What we know with confidence is this. The final days recorded in that logbook describe a crew under significant emotional and environmental strain. The last log entry, dated December 15th, is often quoted as reading, "Storm finished, sea calm. God is over all." It's a haunting, almost biblical final line, and it's part of what has made this case so enduring in popular imagination. I have to tell you honestly, as your host and as someone who cares about giving you the real story, the exact wording and even the existence of this specific final entry has been disputed by historians. Some believe it was embellished or altered in later retellings, possibly influenced by the same poetic tradition that gave us fictional untouched dinners and stopped clocks frozen at the moment of disaster. What we do know, from Robert Muirhead's official investigation, the man sent by the Northern Lighthouse Board to examine the scene just days after the disappearance, is far less poetic and far more disturbing in its own quiet way. Muirhead found the station in a state that suggested urgency, not calm departure. Oilskins, the heavy waterproof coats keepers wore in severe weather, were missing for 2 of the 3 men, but the 3rd set remained, hanging in its place. Think about what that means. If all 3 men left the lighthouse to deal with an emergency, why would one of them go out without the very gear designed to protect him from the elements? Was he in such a hurry that he simply forgot? Was he already outside when whatever happened, and never returned to retrieve his coat at all? Muirhead also documented damage to equipment near the West Landing, one of 2 access points to the island, used specifically for retrieving supplies and securing gear during rough weather. A box normally used to store mooring ropes and crane equipment had been overturned, its contents scattered. Ropes were displaced, tangled in ways that suggested significant force. This is the detail that would come to define the leading theory in the case, because the West Landing, despite sitting over 100 feet above sea level, high above the waterline, showed clear signs of storm damage. Waves, in certain conditions, along that stretch of coastline, are known to reach extraordinary heights, driven by the unique geography of the islands funneling and amplifying ocean swells into towering, unpredictable surges. Muirhead's conclusion, delivered to the Northern Lighthouse Board in the weeks following the disappearance, was measured, professional, and devastating in its simplicity. He believed the men had gone out, likely during or immediately after a storm, to secure equipment and check on the landing. And somewhere in that process, a rogue wave, sudden and immense, swept them from the rocks. All 3, together or in a horrifying sequence. One man swept away first, the 2nd rushing to help him, the 3rd following in desperation. Each decision compounding the tragedy until all 3 were gone. No bodies were ever recovered. No trace of the men was ever found, not on the island, not washed ashore on the mainland, not anywhere. The sea, in this case, kept its secrets absolutely. Somewhere beyond mile marker 47, there is a question that has never been fully answered. Not who took these men, but what exactly in those final hours made 3 trained, careful professionals abandon every protocol they'd sworn to follow. We're going to look at that question more closely, because before we get to theories, we need to understand the evidence at the scene itself, and that evidence is where this story gets genuinely unsettling. We're going back to Eilean Mòr now, back to December 26, 1900, 11 days after the Hesperus first arrived to that terrible silence. This is when Robert Muirhead, superintendent of the Northern Lighthouse Board, finally set foot on the island himself to conduct a full, methodical investigation. Muirhead was not a man given to sensationalism. He was an engineer, a bureaucrat in the best sense of the word, precise, thorough, uninterested in ghost stories or speculation. And what he documented in his official report remains to this day the single most important piece of evidence in this entire case. Let's walk through it together, point by point, exactly as he found it. The lighthouse itself was in good working order. The light apparatus was clean, properly maintained. Everything you would expect from keepers who took their duties seriously right up until the moment something interrupted them. This detail matters enormously because it tells us the men were not neglecting their responsibilities. Whatever happened, happened suddenly, not through slow decay or abandonment, but through immediate, unexpected crisis. Inside the living quarters, Muir had noted the beds were unmade, consistent with keepers who had woken and moved on to their duties without pause. A meal, according to some accounts, remained partially prepared, though I have to caution you again. The famous image of an untouched, still steaming dinner is largely a poetic invention, not a documented fact from Muirhead's actual report. What is documented is far less dramatic, and in some ways far more chilling in its ordinariness. Simply, a home left as though its occupants intended to return within minutes. Now, the clock. This detail has taken on almost mythic significance in retellings of this story. Some versions claim the clock stopped at a precise, dramatic moment, frozen forever at the instant of the men's disappearance. The historical reality is more mundane, though no less unsettling in context. A stopped clock in an unmanned lighthouse simply indicates that no one had been present to wind it. It's not a supernatural clue. It's a mechanical fact, pointing to an absence of days, not a frozen moment of horror. Outside, at the West Landing, this is where the physical evidence becomes genuinely significant. Picture the geography with me. The West Landing sits over 100 feet above the normal waterline, accessed by a steep, narrow path cut into the cliffside. It was used specifically for retrieving supplies, securing ropes, and maintaining the crane apparatus used to haul equipment up from the sea. It was, by design, a place the keepers visited only when necessary, and only with extreme caution. Muir had found a storage box, used to hold mooring ropes and crane materials, completely overturned. Its contents, ropes, tools, equipment, scattered and displaced with what he described as considerable force. A crane, positioned well above typical wave height, showed damage consistent with being struck by something far more powerful than ordinary surf. This is the detail that should stop you in your tracks. A landing site more than 100 feet above the sea, damaged as though the ocean itself had reached up and struck it directly. Now, I want to explain something about the geography of the Flannan Isles that most retellings of this case leave out entirely, because it's the key to understanding how something so seemingly impossible could actually happen. The waters surrounding Eilean Mòr are shaped by a unique combination of underwater topography and prevailing Atlantic swells. Under certain storm conditions, waves approaching the island can be funneled and amplified by the shape of the seabed and coastline, creating what oceanographers now recognize as extraordinarily powerful rogue waves. Waves capable of reaching heights that would seem, to anyone unfamiliar with the specific dynamics of this coastline, almost physically impossible. This is not folklore. This is not speculation dressed up as science. Modern oceanographic study of the Flannan Isles has confirmed that this stretch of coastline is uniquely capable of producing waves that can strike landing sites more than 100 feet above normal sea level. Precisely the kind of event that would explain the damage Muir had documented. So here is the picture that emerges when we set aside the ghost stories and look only at what the physical evidence tells us. A storm, whether on the 12th, as Marshall's possibly inaccurate log suggests, or in the days immediately following, battered the island with unusual ferocity. At some point, likely after the worst of the weather appeared to pass, the keepers determined it was necessary to check on equipment at the West Landing. Perhaps concerned about storm damage, perhaps simply following standard procedure to secure gear before it could be lost or destroyed. All three men went. This, in itself, was already a violation of standard lighthouse protocol, which required at least one keeper to remain inside at all times. But isolation breeds its own logic. On a rock this small, in weather this severe, perhaps it felt safer, more sensible, for all three to handle a dangerous task together rather than split their limited manpower. And then, the sea did what the sea does on that stretch of coastline. A wave, sudden, immense, entirely without warning, rose up over that 100-foot landing and swept across the rocks where the men were working. Whether all three were struck simultaneously, or whether. And this is the theory many investigators find most probable. One man was caught first, and the other two, in a desperate, human instinct to help a drowning companion, moved closer to the water's edge and were caught in turn. We will never know with certainty. What we know is this. 3 men went out to secure ropes and equipment against a battered coastline, and the coastline took them instead. No bodies were ever found. No wreckage, no clothing, no trace washed ashore in the weeks and months that followed. The North Atlantic, in this case, offered no closure. Only an empty lighthouse, a stopped clock, and a logbook full of increasingly unsettling entries that stop mid-sentence on the 15th of December. Before we close tonight's episode, I want to address the theories that have grown up around this case in the century since. Because you deserve to know not just what likely happened, but why so many other, stranger explanations have taken root in the public imagination. Foreign spies, sea serpents, ghosts, curses, supernatural abduction. We're going to separate all of that from the truth. Every mystery, given enough time, grows barnacles. Stories attach themselves to the original facts the way sea life clings to a shipwreck, layer after layer, until the true shape of the thing underneath becomes almost impossible to see. The Flannan Isles disappearance is no exception. In fact, it might be one of the most heavily mythologized true crime cases in maritime history, which is exactly why I think it's so important, tonight, to separate what actually happened from what we've collectively imagined might have happened. Let's start with the poem. In 1912, 12 years after the disappearance, a poet named Wilfred Wilson Gibson published a piece called Flannan Isle. It's beautifully written. Genuinely, it's a haunting piece of literature. But it is also almost entirely fiction. Gibson never visited the island. He never spoke with Robert Muirhead or reviewed the actual investigation. He wrote a poem, drawing loosely on newspaper reports, and in doing so, he invented several of the details that people today believe to be documented historical fact. The untouched meal, still sitting on the table as though the men had vanished mid-bite. The overturned chair, positioned as though someone had leapt up in sudden terror. These images are evocative, cinematic even, but they simply do not appear in Muirhead's official report. They are the product of a poet's imagination, repeated so many times across a century of retellings that fiction hardened into something people now mistake for fact. This happens more often than you'd think in cases like this. A dramatic detail, invented once for artistic effect, gets repeated in a magazine article, then a radio program, then a television documentary, then 100 internet articles copying from each other without ever returning to the original source material. By the time it reaches us, it feels like established truth. It isn't. Now let's talk about the theories that emerged from that fictional foundation, because once people believed something eerie and inexplicable had happened inside that lighthouse, rather than something violent and explicable happening outside it, at the landing. The door opened wide for increasingly strange explanations. Sea serpents. Yes, genuinely, this was a proposed theory in some tabloid coverage from the era. Some enormous, unknown creature rising from the North Atlantic and dragging the men into the depths. There is, of course, no evidence whatsoever to support this. No sightings, no marks, nothing beyond the human fascination with monsters as an explanation for the unexplainable. Foreign spies, or some form of espionage-related abduction, were also floated, particularly given the lighthouse's strategic coastal position. This theory gained a small amount of traction decades later during periods of heightened geopolitical tension, but it has never been supported by any credible historical evidence. There was no wartime context in 1900 that would explain such an event, and no records from any foreign government ever surfaced referencing an operation on Eilean Mòr. Ghost stories, understandably, followed naturally. Claims that the lighthouse itself was haunted even before the disappearance, that keepers had reported strange sounds or presences in the years prior. These stories, again, emerged largely after the fact, woven backward into the narrative to make the tragedy feel more inevitable, more supernatural, than the mundane, brutal reality of a rogue wave on a dangerous coastline. And then there's the theory of desertion. The idea that the men simply chose to leave, faking their disappearance for reasons unknown. This theory collapses almost immediately under basic scrutiny. There was no boat missing from the island. No vessel to explain how 3 men could simply walk away from a location accessible only by sea. Wherever they went, they did not sail there. So what does the evidence actually tell us when we strip away the poetry and the tabloid speculation? It tells us 3 men, isolated on one of the most remote postings in the British Isles, faced a violent storm that likely damaged critical equipment at their landing site. It tells us they went out, together, in violation of standard protocol, to secure that equipment. A decision driven by isolation, by necessity, and perhaps by the simple human instinct to face a dangerous task as a team rather than alone. And it tells us that the coastline of Eilean Mòr, uniquely capable of producing waves that can strike more than 100 feet above sea level, took all 3 of them in a moment too sudden and too violent for any of them to survive or escape. No monsters, no spies, no hauntings, just isolation, duty, and an ocean that has never once, in the history of human seafaring, made any promises about mercy. The Northern Lighthouse Board, in the aftermath, made a significant change to protocol at remote lighthouses across Scotland. A direct, practical response to the tragedy. Keepers were instructed more explicitly never to leave the light unmanned, and additional safety measures were implemented at dangerous landing sites like the one on Eilean Mòr. In this way, even in tragedy, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur left something behind. A lesson, written in loss, that likely protected keepers on other remote stations for decades to come. The lighthouse itself was eventually automated in 1971, ending the era of resident keepers on Eilean Mòr entirely. Today, it stands unmanned, its lights still operating, still warning ships away from that same dangerous coastline. A mechanical monument to 3 men whose final moments remain, and likely will always remain, unknown. I think about that a lot, honestly. About the specific, quiet horror of a mystery with no ending, no bodies to bury, no confession, no trial, no verdict. Just an empty lighthouse, a stopped clock, and a logbook that stops mid-thought on an ordinary Saturday in December, over a century ago. Somewhere beyond mile marker 47, the light on Eilean Mòr is still burning tonight, fully automated, needing no one to tend it, no one to write in its logs, no one to wonder if they'll make it through the next storm. But I like to imagine in some quiet way that James, Thomas, and Donald are still out there too. Not as ghosts, not as anything supernatural, but simply as a reminder that the sea does not care about our protocols, our procedures, our careful rules designed to keep us safe. It takes what it wants to take, and sometimes all it leaves behind is a question. That's tonight's episode of Midnight at Wolf Cloud Station. If this case has stayed with you the way it stayed with me, share it with someone tonight. Tell them about the light that went dark. Tell them about the men who never came home. Keep the doors locked, and keep a light burning somewhere just in case. The frequency is closing. This has been Sierra Sterling. Until next time.